Hello. Let me remind myself of two things at the start. One, that there was a revolution in the 1970s, and they threw out the ideal society that the United States was so well known for. And they institutionalized the opposite of that. In psychology, they threw out being a normal and well-adjusted person. In economics, the idea of making money by making people better off, a huge middle class, home economics. And in courts, they said there would be no religion in government. And in doing so, they threw out those elements that make up God and country, which is a judicial court. And which brings us to the second point. They institutionalized a sophisticated court, a court that will establish facts that aren't true as true. And along with it, they institutionalized the idea of making money by causing people to have to work more hours, causing poverty. And that's as true with the press. We have a sophistical press. And with the voting, they threw out the Australian voting system. And so now we don't have a judicial election process. We have a sophistical election process. Let's add something else. In Ireland today, they passed a law that said that you couldn't discriminate against homosexuality, a hate crimes bill. Well, hold on a second. Is it okay to discriminate against homosexuality? Yes. It's okay to discriminate against homosexuality because you're obligated to discriminate again in favor of the gal who changes the dirty diapers, gets the sex, even if that's nothing more than a religious construct. People starve if you don't do that. So let me remind myself, the shop manual definition of mental illness is the normal taken into the abnormal, from a cold to the flu to pneumonia. The Catholics say, hold on a sec, go back from pneumonia, back to the flu, and back to a cold, and the normal is normal but not good enough. So you put that sack right side in. These thoughts, you sit there and fantasize about the gals until you become sexually aroused, and then do it again, only this time you're trying to get the gal pregnant, and you'll see a sense of original sin with a snap of a finger. You put that together with the other very famous argument, willing the good of another person, and you do that because of Christ's divinity as faith, the real presence of Christ in the communion, and that dot on the lowercase letter I, and those three things make up God and country. So when they talk about homosexuality, they're actually talking about malice and the consequences of malice. People starving, other people starving. Let me remind myself again that when one of the reasons you practice virtue is because other people are made better off. One of the reasons you don't practice virtue is that it makes you better off, but it causes other people to starve. Let me remind myself again that judges wear black robes in the United States because Catholic priests 500 years ago in England wore black robes. And they was, in using our lingo, the priest is on one side and the pimp is on the other. Well, all the laws would favor the priest, favor people trying to be normal and well-adjusted, and against people who were malicious. That argument of good and evil was thrown out in the United States, and the whole point is to reestablish that. Let me remind myself also that if they had just enforced child abuse laws in the 1970s, as well as treason laws, then groups such as the Women's Liberation Movement and the Civil Rights Movement, Harry the Hippie and Al the Afro and Donna the Feminist, they would never have gotten to first base. Now let's go back to Kamala Harris. She wants to destroy the United States, and she does it by hustling, by the routine of a pimp, by the same tactics that they do in the Soviet Union and China and all the other countries. Let me remind myself of something else as well. When you jump from the priest side of things to the pimp side of things, that's it. That's an act of violence. There are no words you're going to say to these people. They're incredibly violent, and you and I are just going to have to face up to it. You always have to sneak something else in, and I enjoy going. I walk around an awful lot here by the University of Arizona in Tucson, and there are lots of houses by the university that have Kamala Harris for president signs in their front yards. And if you knocked on the door and said, "Okay, you go live in the world you built," you get out of that house. That's home economics, and you go live in a world of individual rights. There's a nice spot on a sidewalk right over there. You go live in the darn thing. They would kick and scream and cry if you did nothing more than make them live in the world they fight for. And they also kick and scream emotionally when they stand up for Kamala Harris. It has nothing to do with logic, and then you realize they play on the person's emotions, and that emotion is one of the powerful things that you and I have to address. If you happen to be one of those people, let me remind myself of something else. Everybody goes through that, and your emotions, the emotions of those people that are for Kamala Harris, are not supposed to win over the idea of putting food in that 2 or 3-year-old down the street. There's a sense of priority, and you just have to get over it. A human being stops and shakes and shivers and naturally gets violent in order to shore up their opinion, so to speak. And so you take a step back, you arrange things along the lines of the classic battle of good and evil. The priest is on one side and people who hustle are on the other, and now you start to have an argument. Quite frankly, anything inside the curbs on the road when it comes to the priest side of things, the being normal and well-adjusted side, the home economic side, this camp wins. Everything else is for the pros to talk about. So what's wrong? They threw out God and country. What do you do about it? You go back to being a Yank, and if you can't be a Yank without being a philosophical fancy pants, then you go to the Supreme Court, for example, and you institutionalize the Apostles' Creed. And now you've dotted the letter I, and then you take it from there. You've institutionalized home economics. How do you do it? Well, it's a 4-step process. The first is to publicize it, to come up with a course that teaches a fella a sense of original sin. Then, after you publicize a sense of original sin so everybody knows what they're talking about, here in the United States it becomes a straightforward 3-step process. If you can't turn to lawyers, you turn to courts. If you can't turn to courts, you follow in the footsteps of the Founding Fathers. You take a step back, you grab your 3-cornered hat and fife and drum, and I'm sure they won't be violent. Then you would, here in Tucson, go to the courthouse, and you would replace those judges with our poor slob of a criminal trial attorney and prosecuting attorney, those people that would defend the poor and the oppressed. Then you would head over, as an example, to the university here, and so many of those departments would disappear, and you would replace them with a College of Home Economics, and that would represent phase 1. Phase 2, you would go between Tucson and Tombstone and pretend there's a ladder that's upside down and turn the ladder right side up. Here in this neighborhood where this house is, just by the university, they would buy the houses and turn them into rentals and move up in the foothills and collect rent. And so I'm sure that those people would give up their rental houses, and they would go and form a class of peasantry beneath the class of peasantry that they built. And then you would turn around and find the gal who is an honest-to-goodness home economist and the guy who would come across with a bicycle for the kids at Christmas time, and they get to live in their house. They don't rent property to people, and they don't rent property from people. And you go back to home economics. And then phase 3, home economics. This is where guys like Donald Trump would be in his glory. You picture a 1950s American house. You go off to the side, start with farming and mining, then above that manufacturing, above that wholesale, retail, and repair, above that retirement, education, and recreation. Doctors and lawyers form a kind of ladder that holds it all together, and the Catholic priest is what causes it all to come into being. And then you Darwinize to heaven. Ask the gal how many oranges she wants to use. You know how many orange trees to plant in order to get everybody out of poverty and into plenty. And that's what you do. Now, as far as this election goes, Donald Trump could have 90% of the votes, and he's still going to lose the election for the same reason that people lose the elections in the Soviet Union and China and all the other countries. Someone is just going to have to face up to these guys. You can't go run off to the side and become a special forces character. And you can't go off to the other side and become a social worker. You have to turn around and face these guys. If you'd enforce the laws, then everything would be okay. So go and gather our gang in the playground. We'll see you tomorrow.